Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. Today we have an insta-pod right on the breaking news. We had a big court case come down this morning. Not totally unexpected results, but maybe some surprise in the unanimity and the sort of uh, the kind of the absoluteness of the decision, for lack of a better word. And it's also a case that we have been following really closely, and we in the sense of Kate. So, Kate, what happened?
So, today we got our case on Mifepristone. This was the one where this group of anti abortion doctors, this kind of like hastily cobbled together association that was formed in Amarillo, Texas, right after Dobbs, with the pretty express intent to plant this lawsuit with Merrick and go through the Fifth Circuit, this pipeline we've seen before and we've talked a lot about on the pod. They're seeking to get Mifepristone yanked from the market altogether, to get its FDA approval revoked, but short of that, to reimpose all these restrictions that the agency has lifted in recent years, a lot of which kind of go towards the convenience of getting the medication. So allowing it to be dispensed at pharmacies and not just, clinics, letting it be mailed, all that kind of stuff. And as you say, Josh, this is what we expected, because the anti-abortion doctors here just could not prove standing, right? They had no anecdotes about, I was on call in the emergency room and a woman came in having terrible side effects from mifepristone and I had to complete an abortion for her, even though that's against my moral code. There was just none of that. It was all this very kind of speculative, tenuous net of, well, maybe one day I'll be the only doctor on call and everyone else will be stuck in traffic and I'll have no choice but to complete an abortion against my conviction. So everyone knew that this was silly, but it wasn't a foregone conclusion that we'd get here, because Merrick granted the standing, Fifth Circuit granted the standing. Um, the Alito and Thomas would have let the Fifth Circuit's ruling stand while the Supreme Court, prepared to take it up. So that kind of indicated that they were on board with the way the Fifth Circuit handled this case. But ultimately, we got a unanimous opinion written by Kavanaugh, really just staked on this standing piece. It didn't get too much into the merits. It was more about, they couldn't prove an injury. That's a basic tenet of the law. And can you imagine how terrible the slippery slope would be if we let doctors sue the FDA because a drug has side effects, right? And that increases their workload, or increases the chance that maybe they'll get sued for malpractice in the course of treatment, or the even kind of wider span of firefighters will get to sue because the way a building is arranged makes fires more likely, or police officers will get to sue if a new law creates some uptick in crime, just this kind of big slippery slope thing, which they're right about. But the real conclusion here is just, it's not so much we should kind of be taking to the streets to celebrate this, because this is obviously the right conclusion, but it's still somewhat of a relief that there is a standard of shoddiness that even this Supreme Court won't accept in arguments that further their kind of ideological aims, because there is no such standard at the Fifth Circuit or at Matthew Kacsmarek's court in Amarillo.
Well, listen, it seems like there are two issues. One is that when you got into uh, you know these hypotheticals about a doctor maybe one day has to perform an abortion, and in a lot of these cases even whether those would be abortions is highly dubious. It's really more if you have a woman who is already terminated her pregnancy, but she's hemorrhaging, or so even that is even taking their theory on its own terms. But it is worth, I think, stepping back a little and say, and sort of reminding ourselves that with medicines, the people who should have standing are the people who want to take it and the people who conceivably might be injured by it, i.e., patients. The idea that like a doctor there's something so deeply perverse even in the conceptual structure of the argument, let alone that they couldn't even prove an injury on the terms of their own, or of their own argument. And it seems, is it not the case that in this case, um there's potentially not only this question of just shoddiness, like, are you kidding, right? This is just, it makes no sense, that this is a case that has a lot of non-abortion dependencies, and I would assume that a number of the justices were pretty keen on that, i.e., do you want some rando coming forward with a statin that's been on the market for 30 years and saying, "Oh, actually, this." What it opens up, and I have no doubt that the I mean, with this court, I suspect they have ways of communicating these things. The pharmaceutical industry would not like this because we've got a system. You run it by the FDA says good to go. And then, as I recall you telling me, there's a window of time in which litigation is possible. And I would assume after, you know, if 10 years later a lot of people start getting sick from medication, I'm sure it can be reopened. But absent those things, it's done. And that gives stability to the whole, just to the whole medical economy. How much did that come up in the arguments in when this case came to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, a decent amount. Really, the arguments all kind of centered on the standing thing of pushing Erin Hawley, wife of Josh Hawley, to kind of give any episodes where these people would kind of need protection from having to dispense the drug. But what you're talking about, the kind of pharmaceutical drug landscape, that was a huge theme in the amicus briefs, especially. You had a lot of kind of, pharmaceutical like trade organizations and companies kind of saying, you realize this is going to destroy the entire system if you give outstanding to kind of anyone who objects to any drug, even if it doesn't touch their life in any meaningful way. And that's some of the strongest writing in Kavanaugh's opinion, I think, where he doesn't even kind of have to entertain the, I might have to treat them one day. We had to spend money to kind of whip up public opposition to the FDA's changes here. And he just said, the Constitution does not grant standing because you object to other people using or prescribing a drug. That's ridiculous. I mean, if that was the case, then anyone complaining about any government change could basically come into the courts to object to it. On the doctor front, some of his hypotheticals were like, well, under this theory, doctors could sue if you increased a speed limit, right? And they had to treat more car crash victims, or expanded gun rights and more gunshot victims, which it's funny because every example he raised, part of me was like, yeah, do it, but so yeah,
But
I
you
mean,
also see they're going through the sort of a lot of these, at least the hypotheticals you've mentioned, which I assume are actually in most cases from the decision. He seemed to be name checking, right wing hobby horses.
yep,
They're going to come and they're going to do a lot more regulation. They're going to come for our guns, almost like they were you. It seems almost that you're getting a window in to the what is it called when they have their the judicial conference, the
right,
conferences they have when they talk these things over, to get Alito and Thomas, like, come on, let's
yep,
do it, let's make it unanimous.
totally. There was that, and then there was, this happened at oral argument too, especially from Kavanaugh and Barrett, but great pains taken to kind of comfort actual anti-abortion doctors who, are in emergency room situations or kind of have to treat a wide swath of patients. It's great pains taken to confirm that you don't have to perform abortions if you don't want to, and they brought us up again and again at oral argument, and he quoted kind of extensively from oral argument to confirm this. But the idea that there are federal conscience protections, the idea that EMTALA, which is still pending in another case, the law that means hospitals kind of have to stabilize all patients who are in states of crisis, no matter if they can pay or not, but that EMTALA might require hospitals writ large to perform abortions if that means stabilizing the patient, but that those mandates don't filter down to an individual level, right? Like an individual doctor wouldn't have to perform the abortion, just the specific hospital that's taking in federal funds does. So there was definitely some kind of calm down anti-abortion movement, like I wouldn't want you to take this opinion as me not being on your side. They use the phrase pro-life throughout, which is like a little wink and a nod. You get to Thomas's concurrence, which we'll get into, and he full out just uses the word abortionist. So they make clear where they're coming from.
There is this is not central, well, I guess it was somewhat central to the plaintiff's argument in this case. But as you mentioned, the need to stabilize a patient, even if it involves an abortion. This, as a general matter, just myself, do I need, does every doctor need to perform, one abortion a year just to show they're really up for the fight? I mean, look, if someone feels strongly about it, of course not. That's fine. I don't, but if someone comes into your emergency room and they might die, you need to do everything you can. Or maybe you just can't be a doctor.
Yeah.
And again, I really say that with, to the extent it is workable with everyone's rights, fine. You believe what you believe and everybody gets along, and great. But the idea that even this is a question, that are you really saying that the person should bleed out because you have, that is shocking. And it really makes me question if you should be in the doctor business.
Pretty hard to square with the Hippocratic Oath. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so, that's it. Now, is there, is it possible? I think some people were asking me today when this came out, well, okay, these guys were idiots and they couldn't even show standing. But do you have the sense that other more, concerted efforts are going to come at this in a different way and maybe get back to this?
I think the problem is the plaintiffs here and the kind of right-wing law firm that was behind them, they knew they had real standing issues, and they took
Yeah.
pretty great pains to try to make the anecdotal record a little more robust.
Yeah.
So I kind of suspect that if there was at least low-hanging fruit of, a woman who did have terrible side effects or something who was kind of willing to be part of this, they would have sniffed her out by now
Yeah.
and kind
No,
of
I think
stuck
that's
her as
right.
part of the group. Yeah.
I think that's right. Is there, there's, going back to the impact on the larger pharmaceutical industry. There are people and I don't agree with them in general, but there are a lot of people who have all sorts of arguments about various antidepressant drugs, and there are certain. I don't even want to get into it because it's such a technical issue and it's so fraught. Um, but you have people who think, oh, these drugs are terrible and I don't think they should be on the market. And to the extent that you get that into the courts is just nuts. To the extent that, I mean, and this was sort of one of the sort of secondary or out, kind of ancillary issues to this case, that you have judges presuming to, speak to how dangerous are these drugs? Well, on this particular drug, there's really not much question, but some drugs do have dangers, and lots of people, many people from themselves or their families know it can do good things, it can do bad things, and it's you got to you have to make your own decision. Um, the so they are personally complicated questions or medically complicated questions, but the idea that you're going to have just some judge on the Fifth Circuit reading just anecdotes is it's just you need the FDA doing this. And I'm not saying the FDA, obviously the FDA has its own issues, but at least you convene actual doctors, right? And they can make mistakes, but that's better than convening a bunch of right-wing lawyers who have a an interest in the outcome. Anyway, sort of
No,
ancillary issues.
totally. And that also really gets to the heart of how the anti abortion movement is so infantilizing to women and always has been. Because we all know the deal with taking medicine, right? Like most drugs have side effects. And the way adults are trusted to deal with that is that, between you and your doctor, right? You talk about the side effects, you decide if whatever your underlying ailment is, it's worth the side effects to deal with it, and that's how you move forward. It's the same way adults would use mifepristone, and in that case, as you say, I mean, for most people, it's an easy call because the side effects are so rare and the common ones are small, and, it is incredibly effective. But this has always been one of the hats the anti-abortion movement will wear is, well, we're just really, really worried about the safety and health of women, which is, of course, not true to begin with because childbearing and pregnancy are so much more
Is
dangerous to women
inherently
than
dangerous. Yeah,
abortion.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But, it's a way for them to kind of be like, we're just looking out, right? And then you kind of forget that in that equation, women are basically having their rights stripped to that of like children, where you need somebody else to make the decision for you.
Yeah, and just a final point on this issue. I think we all know anybody who has ever taken an even semi-serious medication, kind of not to look at the full list of potential
Right.
side effects because this
Death
has been
always is the last
yeah,
one.
exactly. It's you're like headache, bloating, w- uh stroke, death, just
Yeah.
drugs have all sorts of side effects, and as you can see, I mean, certainly learning mostly from you on this, it seems like even the rare side effects are pretty manageable. You may have some hemorrhaging, you go to an emergency room, they can deal with it. So it's again, it seems to be a very safe drug, and even the horror stories are, except for the most extreme cases, manageable and basically okay. Um, so yeah, so is this okay? So let's kind of jump back to big picture. It sounds like there are lots of other issues with this case that we should definitely not think, wow, I guess they've been brushed back from the plate a bit on abortion. They're kind of, they're not gonna they're not gonna do any more bad stuff. I assume that's not what we should draw from this.
Right. And some of the kind of cynical flash takes I'm seeing circulating is, and to be honest, I find this a little overcooked, but is okay, what if they took this case, which in the first place, the Supreme Court should not have taken this case. If the people didn't have standing, guess what? That means you don't have to take it at all, right? You can just say they don't have standing, we're done with this. But so they take this case, right? Everyone is kind of lighting their hair on fire for months because if they reimpose restrictions on mifepristone, that affects the whole country, including blue states with like robust access to abortion. Okay, so everyone's panicked. They come out with a unanimous decision. Oh my God, like comedy, bipartisanship. This course sounds so bad. The liberals are agreeing with the conservatives, right? And they get all these headlines about how the Supreme Court kind of saved mifepristone, and thank God. So then we go into the election and no one's mad about abortion, and the potency of that tool is totally blunted, and the court are the good, reasonable guys. Okay, so my thing is, if that's I just I don't think you get everyone on board with a plan like that, right? Like, if that was a
Yeah.
plan, I don't think Thomas and Alito would have said, "We love what the Fifth Circuit did, keep going." I think it's much more likely that they would have upheld the Fifth Circuit if they had the votes. They didn't have the votes and ultimately decided, it's all done on standing, right? That makes it sound kind of like serious, normal judges. Maybe this isn't the exact forum where we're going to kind of get into our anti-abortion craziness, right? And then you also have the fact that this was the big banner abortion case of the term, but there's another big one that we're still waiting on. And that is the one that has to do with EMTALA, that law I brought up before, which basically hinges on, can state abortion bans supersede the federal mandate that hospitals have to stabilize all patients, kind of no matter how you do it. Again, that case is just as legally simple as this one. Federal laws trump state ones. So if you have got a woman in an emergency room who needs an abortion, or she is going to die or become very sick, you have to do it. It doesn't matter what the state says. But that one was way less lopsided during oral argument compared to this Mifepristone one. It's a lot less clear to me that they're going to come down on the side of, I guess, kind of quote unquote abortion rights. It's barely abortion rights. It's just like kind of basic healthcare in that case. So, if you're kind of taking the cynical, they're doing things for optics route, maybe you take the bigger one, come down the obvious kind of right way there, and then think that gives you a little more wiggle room to be terrible on this other case. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There's no I cannot imagine them as a group operating that way. Certainly not Thomas and Alito operating that way. What I could see is they get in there and say, this is really just kind of Thomas and Alito. Like, you're going to get smoked, first of all. That, let's be honest and say the standing is a joke here. We know it's a joke. Like, we get you want to kind of get back on your, pro-life hobby horse, but the standing issue is a joke. So, we're not doing great in the court of public opinion. So why don't we just kind of deal with this as a standing issue, unanimous, not because we're trying to do some Hail Mary about the, some sort of double fake about the other thing, but like, you know, let's just let this chalice pass from our lips and move on to other things. I can see that argument because I think that's how you get from uh, the people who wanted to take the case wanting to take the case and then turning around and shutting it down on standing issue, which again, it does allow everybody to go there because it truly is open and shut from a standing point of view on like two or three different levels. And I will say, one other point with this other case you make, it's crazy from a legal perspective. It's shocking from a moral perspective to me.
Totally.
Are you really going to let a woman just die because you're not, that is a, uh, I think um, we know that life of the mother protections are are tend to be pretty toothless in the event. But I would assume when you're talking about under this standard of just stabilizing someone, that's a that's a very low standard. That's getting them out of a critical situation. So that's not. So I would think that you know takes off the table. She needs an abortion because she has a high chance of developing liver failure during the rest of her pregnancy. This is sort of like somewhat, there's all these technical words when someone is, decompensating or stable or something. Again, it's just shocking to me that is allowed to be a question regardless of the legal structure of the argument.
I mean, and it shows how hell bent, the anti abortion movement and the kind of states that are part of that movement
Yep.
are on just eradicating abortion from every corner, right? And for a long time, kind of pre Dobbs, they got away with saying, with making it out to be that abortion is just this like siloed off thing. It's just like kind of irresponsible young women who like didn't use birth control, right? And then we have Dobbs, and then we have all the flood of horror stories of, you know, women bleeding out in parking lots, and women who desperately want their child having some horrible mishap in their third trimester, like all that kind of stuff. And from a political optics perspective, that's when you might expect the anti-abortion movement to back off a little bit and to be like, well, we're not talking about the quote unquote good women, right? Like that's not our problem. And kind of focus on, you know, the sluts. But that just, we haven't seen that happen, right? I mean, when it's children being raped, when it's like mothers who already have children kind of like going through these emergencies, they're just like, no, they don't get abortions either. And it's just, it's so stunning because clearly part of the potency, you know, the electoral potency of Dobbs comes from these stories that are universally sympathetic, even to people who are otherwise ideologically aligned with the right. And we've seen the kind of damage that it's done the party that's aligned with the movement, but they don't pull back, you know? It's just over and over again. They're just like, no, this is what we want. A totally draconian no abortion under any circumstances environment, even if that means, you know, women dying. That's just kind of the cost of doing business.
I certainly know this is not the main impetus, because these things are certainly not new for the anti-abortion movement, but at the margins, I think we can see that with mifepristone, with the ability to mail it around the country, that that women who have an accidental pregnancy find out, you know, when they miss their first period, you know, find out very early. Those women have sort of escaped the grasp of the pro-life movement in many ways. Not entirely. You know, sometimes you need to go to a clinic, whatever, but for a lot of women in that case, if you're in a blue state, whatever, even if you're a red state, you get it mailed. And so in some perverse, horrifying way, the women who are still in the clutches are the expectant mother who the something horrible, you know, kind of
Mm-hmm.
something horrible happens in the third trimester, or they go into sepsis. Like they have to take it out on those women,
Exactly.
because the woman with an accidental pregnancy who just like, hey, I need to take the abortion pill. It's they've lost that fight.
Totally. I mean, which stems directly into, you know, some activity we've seen in Congress this week with the IVF stuff. Like, from just kind of an objective perspective, it's insane that the anti abortion movement and their kind of Republican allies are going after IVF, because the whole point of IVF is for people who really, really want to procreate and are like having difficulty doing so, which you
Yep.
would think aligns directly with their whole, you know, everyone should be having children and the mothers should be taking care of them. Like it does fit in with their whole kind of retrograde worldview, whether or not, you know, the specific people doing IVF kind of are buying that vision. But even then, I mean, the movement is kind of steering them into these shallow waters of like no public popularity whatsoever. And then they're left doing these weird things. Like our colleague Emine was up on the Hill this week asking Republican senators, like, you know, you say you're for IVF, why won't you vote for the Democrats' bill? And they just have to do these weird contortions of like, well, I don't know what else is in it, you know, just kind of bullshit things, because or there's no actual risk to it. This is unnecessary legislation, which is why, like, if it's unnecessary, why don't you just vote for it? So then they
Yeah, but
shoot down the bill, and then they put out this letter they all sign being like, we support IVF, you know, in this totally like meaningless way.
yeah, no, it is there are a few cases in recent American history I can think of where a party is so deeply committed, so deeply invested, when an issue is so stitched into their coalition, into the different organizational components of their coalition, and it's unpopular, and then and they're kind of stuck, right? I mean, they I mean, I'm restraining myself from making making a sort of a pregnancy termination analogy, but it's too deep in them. They can't they can't get rid of it, right? They've spent 50 years just like I said, stitching it into their political coalition.
I mean,
And
and
there you go.
it's such the hallmark of a minoritarian party, right? That like popular opinion just doesn't rate as much with a party who's, to the extent they still have kind of policy planks at all, are all unpopular. You know, they were unpopular back when it was like ruining Medicare and Social Security. It's unpopular now when it's like 10% tariffs on everything. You know, I mean, it's just, it's the way they operate. So, this
Yeah.
kind of hard knot of anti abortion activists just outweigh the entire rest of the country. And I mean, they pay the price for that.
Yeah, no,
But
definitely, definitely.
I also want to talk about the Thomas concurrence before we wrap, because it was interesting. And it's very Thomas to take the opportunity to write, to kind of lay the groundwork for nudging this issue to the right in the future, and this whole kind of line of jurisprudence to bend it towards the right as they work. And for a long time, you know, that was him writing in dissent, right, over and over and over again, his kind of painting his ultra conservative vision. And now that the court has shifted, he's alarmingly closer to the center than ever before. But here I was wondering if he was going to do what he did during oral arguments, if he was going to make another pitch for a Comstock Act case, right? He's been doing that a bit lately, signaling to the litigants, send me this, you know, I'll be on board for it. But this time he just went on this kind of crusade against the concept of associational standing writ large, which is the idea that, you know, groups or organizations can sue on behalf of their individual members. And he was explicit in saying this is unconstitutional. And it means that not only can these doctors not sue on behalf of like random patients, but also abortionists can't sue on behalf of their patients. And we've had
So Planned
cases.
Parenthood can't sue in
Exactly.
the interests of abortion rights, basically. So basically, him saying, "All right, we lost on these doctor guys, but let's take the package we put the doctors in and stick Planned Parenthood, and you know, we're gonna repurpose it for our own
Exactly.
aims." Interesting,
Which is an
interesting.
argument he's raised in abortion cases before. But the kind of greater concern here is who uses associational standing the most. Civil rights groups, right?
Yeah,
Like the NAACP or League of Women Voters, like people who represent often, you know, kind of like under resourced, marginalized people, because these groups have in-house lawyers and resources and kind of litigation teams and all that kind of
yep,
stuff.
yep.
And now Thomas is saying out the window with
Enough
that.
of that.
And who does that leave, right? That's going to be individuals who are personally wealthy enough to kind of mount
Who
their own legal challenge.
Right, which is to say, never, because that never
Exactly.
happens. It never
Right.
happens. You know, conceivably you could have it with in an abortion rights case with a very wealthy woman had, you know, one of these things, she's down in Texas, can't do whatever. But I mean, the cost of litigation, even normal wealthy people can't afford. I mean, it's a multi-year. I mean, it is a perverse thing. And I must say, come back just before we conclude this, in this whole arc of litigation that this Mifepristone case has been over the last year and a half or something like that, I still come back to, it is perverse that doctors can be even the notional plaintiffs for themselves. I can see if doctors say, "Hey, I need to be able to help this person. I need to be able to help that person." So that's, you know, kind of an associational argument. But the idea that um, I might have to help someone in a way that I don't like, so throws on its head the idea of, at least in my mind, what being a doctor is, right? I mean, I remember, you know, during the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, when it maybe wasn't 100% clear that you could be a doctor and not run some meaningful risk of maybe, you know, poking yourself with a pin, an accident, something like that. And some doctors would say, kind of like, hey, I don't want to get AIDS. Not me, you know. Um, uh, in practice, that maybe wasn't a huge case because people who want to work with age, but obviously it comes up in an emergency room context. And as a civilian, I can understand that. I'd be a little scared, in that very early period before tests, a lot of blah, 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 blah. But like we give our society gives doctors a lot of money, a lot of social standing, a lot of power. And we do that because, wow, you guys control life and death. And like that's a big deal. And like you you gotta you gotta pay up too. It's okay, it's not risk free, but we give you guys this stuff. So the whole idea here of, again, doctors having standing vis-a-vis their patients is just so perverse that I haven't been able to get past that
Um,
through this whole conversation.
it's almost reminiscent of me to me of some of these police brutality cases, where they'll be like, well, he looked like he was reaching for his pocket and I was scared, so I shot him. It's like, again, you have an awesome responsibility, and because of that, we let you do stuff that normal people can't do. And then you don't get to turn around and be like, I'm going to keep all the benefits, but the risk of this job I've decided to take is too much for me. I'm not going to give anything in return. It's similar. And I mean, as you say, the real world effect of telling doctors they can't do what they signed up to do as doctors is that all the good ones are leaving these parts of the country because they don't want to not be able to do their jobs. And, what does that leave us with? These red states that already have shockingly high rates of maternal mortality are just going to get worse because all the good OBGYNs are not going to practice there. All the good emergency room doctors aren't going to practice there. It's just this endless cycle that leaves the same people who are always the most vulnerable to this in states where they have fewer protections and are even more likely, to become sick and die. It just makes pregnancy such a scary proposition when you're in this position.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I as someone who has children and who has been blessed with, or my wife was blessed with uneventful pregnancies. Just normal pregnancy is a little
Yeah.
can be a little anxiety provoking. So yeah, it shouldn't be like a Thunderdome situation, right? If you're down in like Alabama or Texas or something like that. In any case, I guess the rest of the cases in this term are more or less through the remainder of this month, with a lot of some question mark even over that.
Yeah, we think. I mean, they got rid of 3 cases today, but Mifepristone was the only high profile one. So we're probably in the neighborhood of 22, 23 total cases left. On our list of kind of the quote unquote major list cases, I'd say we probably have like 10, somewhere around there, of kind of like still really
And
big
we're like almost
ones.
halfway through the month.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would expect them. This was the first week that they did double opinion days. We're recording this on Thursday. Friday is also an opinion day. So they might just start doing 2 or 3 days a week until they get them all off their plate. I wouldn't be super surprised if we go past June. I mean, some things may not be written and finished yet. And it's funny because part of what's taking so long is that this court, like with this case, are taking up ridiculous culture war type cases that engender like a lot of splits between the justices, right? Like in ye olden times, vast majority of the cases are so technical that they're only interesting to like one small corner of tax regulators or something, right? And those
Right,
tend to
right.
be, usually often unanimous or with just kind of easier splits. But when you take up all of this, the Biden administration like can't speak to tech platforms. Well, we're off to the races. It's gonna be a billion pages long. There's gonna be dissents and concurrences. So yeah, it's just a mess.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Well, since we do have a lot of these cases, we'll probably be coming back to you, I think, maybe a few times over the course of this month with these insta-pods. Sometimes as short as 15 minutes. We just want to kind of update you on stuff. This one ran a little longer, but there's a lot involved in this one.
Yeah.
So and we have invested, Kate has invested rightly, a lot of time. I think, some of the best coverage nationwide has been from Kate at TPM, just following every step of this process, and in all its dimensions, its legal dimensions, obviously its medical dimensions, and in the sort of overlapping dimension of this slipstream the judicial right has created with this one ringer judge in Amarillo, Texas,
Right.
who will go for anything, right? There's all these dimensions together. So it's been great work, Kate. And
Thank you.
I think that is all we have for this Instapod edition. And unless there are other big cases before then that are released, we will be back with you. I guess, what is it, next week? We're doing a day early. What was it?
Good
Is it
point.
Tuesday?
Yep. We're
Okay,
off Wednesday, so we'll be coming to your ears Tuesday next week.
Tuesday next week. All right, we will talk to you then.
All right. See you then. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.